Hello and welcome back. I have a brief overview of what was happening in the United States from 1880 to 1914, generally known as the Progressive Era in America. There were some important new inventions, things like the light bulb, as well as the telephone and radio waves. All of these things had a tremendous effect on ordinary everyday life. Heat now in homes through electricity, light through the light bulb itself, and motion. Speed of life is rapidly picking up. Now, stores and factories could operate 24 hours a day through light. They could also power things like conveyor belts, cranes, and machinery in these factories as well. So, all these things had a tremendous impact on the growth and spread of manufactured goods and services. Things like the assembly line allowed people to concentrate on one aspect of the thing they were building and then pass it on to the next person, increasing the speed as well as the productivity. I encourage you to come back later to the slideshow and watch the clip on YouTube and think about these larger questions of the effect of the development of rapid and easily manufactured goods. This all led to a growth in the overall world economy, roughly split into two economic worlds in Europe, those advancing in industry and manufacturing in Northern and Western Europe, and then those still primarily based in agriculture and crops and animals in Eastern and Southern Europe. All of this is underpinned by a school of thought developed by the Scottish author who published his most well-known work on the wealth of nations in the year 1776, pictured here and known as Adam Smith. Smith studied the economy, the buying and selling of goods and services. A good is an item, a thing that you can make and sell. A service is a thing that you do for money. So a good could be a watch, a phone, a computer. A service could be a nurse, a waitress, or a teacher. Smith, being a product of the Enlightenment, believed in the inquiry of science and reason to answer questions, to have a hypothesis, to investigate, and to gather evidence to come to a conclusion. He believed that more freedom for all people eventually was a happier, better, more harmonious world. Prior to Smith's school of thought, Europe was primarily based on simply gaining as much wealth and money as possible, the idea being that one country's gain was necessarily another country's loss, really emphasizing the import of raw materials and the export of polished manufactured goods. Think about the treatment of the colonies by England through taxation, through the Stamp Act, Tea Act, and Sugar Act as well. The larger school of thought here is called mercantilism. It is a great deal of intervention and regulation and price controls by the government. Smith believed that wealth, money, and labor or work were and necessarily should be interconnected, that through increased and more efficient labor, the overall economy and wealth would grow. He believed that this could be accomplished through three general strategies. One was the idea of the invisible hand, that no actual hand set or determined the price of goods, that the government would not say a gallon of milk will cost you $8. Instead, the person who makes the milk and the person who wants to buy it both pursue their own interest for their own benefit, and everybody wins. That they argue, they negotiate, they find the best price, and that the thing that determines the price is quite simply the invisible hand of the market. He also believed that people ought to specialize or have a division of labor. You should concentrate on the things you were good at, and countries should concentrate on the things they were good at. Therefore, free trade between people and countries, and everyone would win and benefit. These are the basic key understandings and philosophies behind the economic role of capitalism. Smith is the father of capitalism, the economic basis of our country today. Key terms, most of these I have talked about and covered. Please make sure that you know them. The last one on here is a French term, laissez-faire. It means sort of hands off. It's the idea that the government should not be involved in the economy. It should take a hands-off role, and everyone wins and benefits as a result. Now, capitalism proved to be incredibly profitable for many people, but it had some unhappy consequences as well. Things like child labor, because children could work cheaply and had tiny hands and fingers to get into complicated looms and machinery. Unclean working conditions, germs, and disease spread through dirty water and a lack of good sewage. Trash, small apartments, long hours, 10, 12, 14-hour days, often for poor or low wages. Therefore, there was some unhappiness with the growing world economy and the triumphant nature of capitalism. One example of this unhappiness is through the Progressive Era, mainly white middle-class people who wanted to help and uplift the poor and the workers in these new factories. They did not want to overthrow the system, they wanted to reform it. And many of these people helping or hoping to reform the system were women. Some important groups within the larger progressive movement were muckrakers, journalists who expose the harsh reality of towns and cities and factories through things like pictures and photographs, through books about the unpleasantness of meat packing and the harsh conditions through which people had to work and labor to make meat to feed the people across the country. We also saw houses in these towns and cities to help educate and civilize the new immigrants working in these towns and factories, to teach them English, how to clean their homes properly, and how to care for their children. I hope that these ideas of sort of like better off white people helping to uplift, to educate, and to civilize other people sound vaguely familiar to you from some of the things we've already talked about involving imperialism. Another example of broad unhappiness is the Communist Manifesto, written and published by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It was originally published in 1848 and is about growing capitalism and the larger world economy. It posits a universal struggle between oppressors and the oppressed over all of history and time. The oppressors, in their idea, in this age of capitalism, were the bourgeoisie, the sort of businessmen, the merchants, the people who own the factories. And the oppressed were the proletariat, the workers, who were doing all of the work but not getting all of the profits. The idea is that conflict between them must necessarily, inevitably lead to revolution. As an example of this politically, there was a party called the Socialist Party in Germany making laws and reforms and efforts to improve the condition of workers. Also, people who work together started to join together and band and fight and strike and argue for improvements through things called unions, unionizing to argue for better working conditions. This ultimately is called communism. The idea being that the goal is wealth is spread evenly for everyone. All people are equal. There is no private property. This is a great idea in theory, but in reality, it necessarily leads to a sort of undemocratic and tends to benefit the few at the expense of the many. We will talk much more about this in the weeks and months to come. A sort of abbreviated version of communism is known as socialism. The idea that there should be some government regulation and control over things like housing to ensure people have free or at least cheaper housing, to ensure more access to good health care, and to have some private property, but also a role for the government to regulate, supervise, or oversee the excesses of the world economy through capitalism. I hope that that is clear to you. I encourage you to look over the other resources and things available and to ask questions. Thank you very much, and goodbye.